This moment marks a profound turning point for the royal family. The announcement lasted under 3 minutes, yet it dismantled decades of established expectations within the monarchy. King Charles entered the private council chamber carrying the sealed crimson folder and placed it before Prince William. With measured gravity, he named the date few anticipated would come so soon. William offered no celebration. Catherine held her silence. As the king disclosed who would oversee the ceremony's design, those present recognized this was no ordinary proclamation. It signaled the quiet beginning of a royal farewell, heavy with the complexities of legacy, duty, and human frailty. Charles had summoned William, Catherine, Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, and a carefully selected group of trusted advisors to Buckingham Palace without offering any explanation for the meeting. The atmosphere was thick with speculation and quiet tension. None of the attendees could be certain whether the gathering concerned matters of national security, the king's health, or the intricate mechanisms of succession planning. This uncertainty was significant because the private council chamber had long been reserved for the most delicate decisions, those too sensitive to risk public debate or media exposure. When the monarch at last opened the crimson folder, his words carried the weight of finality. He announced that William's coronation would occur on Saturday, the 14th of November 2026, at Westminster Abbey, the historic church where generations of British sovereigns had been formally crowned amid centuries of tradition and solemn ritual. William sat motionless and did not reach for the papers before him. "Why now?" William asked, his voice steady yet searching as he looked directly at his father. Charles lowered his gaze rather than responding immediately, and in that prolonged silence lay a depth of emotion that no explanation could fully convey. The future king understood instinctively that a date of such precision had not been chosen without profound consideration and perhaps painful necessity. Catherine, seated beside her husband, absorbed the implications with quiet composure, fully aware that her own elevation to queen consort would fundamentally reshape her public and private life while drawing their young children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, into spheres of duty and expectation far beyond their current years. Then came the second, even more personal revelation. Charles explicitly placed the emotional, symbolic, and ceremonial design of the coronation under Catherine's direct control, signaling a level of trust that would define not only the event itself, but the character and values of the reign that would follow. A coronation is far more than pageantry. It is the ancient constitutional act in which a monarch swears the solemn oath, is invested with the crown and regalia, and publicly accepts the lifelong burden of responsibility for the realm, its people, and its enduring institutions. When Charles entrusted the emotional and symbolic framework of this ceremony to Catherine, Camilla's face hardened with visible displeasure. The queen consort leaned forward in her chair, the tension in her posture suggesting she was prepared to voice a strong objection. Charles, sensing the rising conflict, closed the folder with deliberate finality before she could speak, effectively silencing the challenge in that moment. Princess Anne, ever the keen observer, watched the entire exchange with careful, almost clinical detachment. She understood immediately that the king's decision had opened a deep wound within the family circle, one that would likely fester beneath the polished surface of royal protocol and might not remain hidden from the wider world for long. William finally rested his hand on the crimson cover of the folder, but still made no move to examine its contents. Catherine, offering quiet strength, placed her fingers gently over his wrist. Charles observed the intimate gesture between his son and daughter-in-law with a profound sadness that seemed to age him further in those few seconds. Beneath the king's chair lay a second sealed envelope, marked discreetly with William's initials and the instruction that it was to be opened in private. While the coronation date had now been formally announced, the most significant and potentially painful revelations remained carefully withheld. In the heavy atmosphere of that council chamber, four principal figures confronted their own distinct yet interconnected fears. Charles contemplated the approaching end of the role he had waited nearly a lifetime to fully embody. William faced the daunting reality of a crown arriving before he felt entirely prepared for its immense weight. Catherine quietly considered how this transition would irrevocably transform the lives and futures of her three young children. Camilla, for her part, sensed that the monarchy's next chapter was already being written in ways that might sideline her influence and legacy. Duty still held them together in that confined space, but private grief, resentment, and apprehension threatened to erode the fragile unity. William departed the council chamber carrying the unopened second envelope like an additional invisible weight upon his shoulders. For years, he had immersed himself in constitutional briefings, the exhausting exhaustive study of state papers and the subtle art of how a sovereign must navigate pressure, crisis, and expectation. These preparations had always existed in a somewhat theoretical realm, important but comfortably distant. The announcement of the precise date, November 14, 2026, had collapsed that comforting distance entirely. Every lesson, every briefing, every studied precedent now felt immediate and intensely personal, transformed into a relentless countdown toward kingship. The role was no longer a future contingency to be contemplated at leisure. It had become a fixed destination on the calendar, demanding readiness he was not entirely certain he possessed. Catherine followed him into the quiet corridor, waiting until the heavy doors sealed them off from the rest of the palace. She had already demonstrated remarkable resilience by shouldering greater responsibilities during previous periods of uncertainty, but assuming direct oversight of the coronation now placed her at the absolute epicenter of the monarchy's most sacred institutional transition, where every decision would resonate far beyond the abbey walls. In the relative privacy of the corridor, William confessed that the announced date carried the feeling of a warning rather than an honor, a sudden acceleration of destiny he had long known would arrive, but not so soon. Catherine responded with the quiet firmness and clarity that had become one of her most valued strengths within the family. She reminded him gently but directly that their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, would sense any trace of fear or hesitation in their father long before outsiders or even palace insiders could detect it. Should he allow uncertainty to dominate his demeanor, it risked planting seeds of apprehension toward the crown in the next generation, at a time when stability and confidence were most needed. Her words offered a measure of emotional anchorage without any illusion that the underlying tension and dread could be easily dispelled. Meanwhile, Charles had withdrawn alone to his private study. He removed his spectacles and spent a long moment regarding a framed photograph of his sons, his expression a complex interplay of paternal pride and deep personal regret as he reflected on how the shadow of succession had slowly come to color nearly every conversation between them. Several months before the coronation date became public knowledge, a private continuity ceremony was held at Windsor Castle with the intention of testing the family's readiness for unexpected disruptions. Designed as a shielded rehearsal for ensuring seamless succession in the event of sudden royal incapacity, the gathering was meant to be routine, protected from external eyes and internal politics. Instead, it became a revealing crucible that exposed deep hesitation, simmering rivalries, and significant gaps in coordinated preparedness. Charles left that room carrying the conviction that the monarchy could no longer rely on vague assumptions or the hope that tradition alone would suffice. A firm date had to be fixed, and William needed to be prepared for leadership without further delay. The exercise simulated a major crisis where the monarch was suddenly unable to fulfill key state duties. William entered believing it was merely a controlled academic exercise. Catherine, however, sensed that Charles was observing far more profound qualities: discipline under pressure, loyalty without question, and the emotional fortitude required to hold the institution together when authority itself was in doubt. As advisors outlined the parameters of the fictional crisis, complete with cancelled appearances, delayed constitutional papers, and urgent decisions that could not wait, the room grew tense. A senior official then asked the question that altered everything: who would lead if Charles were no longer able to carry out his duties? Camilla stepped forward before William could respond. With calm but unmistakable resolve, the Queen Consort declared that no transition should proceed without her approval. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to the established order. Charles stared in disbelief. He had expected concern or shared anxiety, not a direct assertion of personal authority. William remained silent out of respect for his father's marriage and position. Catherine immediately recognized the peril. His restraint, born of loyalty, was being read as uncertainty, a misinterpretation that could prove catastrophic in any genuine emergency by creating fractures in the line of command. In a side chamber, immediately following the Windsor rehearsal, away from the others, Charles confronted William with a directness that revealed his growing frustration and concern. The king demanded an explanation for why the prince had not asserted himself more forcefully when Camilla claimed authority over any potential transition. William stood his ground with quiet conviction, replying that he would never openly challenge or fight his father's wife for position or influence while Charles himself still reigned as sovereign. The answer reflected profound filial loyalty and respect, yet it also exposed the inherent risks of leaving questions of succession and power sharing unresolved for so long. Catherine entered the tense discussion a few moments later and spoke without hesitation or deference to protocol. She defended William's silence as a deliberate act of strength rooted in loyalty rather than any form of weakness or indecision. She warned Charles that further delay in clarifying the line of succession would only encourage advisors, courtiers, and extended family members to build competing spheres of influence around the future king before he could properly establish and defend his own authority. Camilla later requested a strictly private meeting with Catherine at Clarence House, the residence that had become closely associated with her personal life and shared years with Charles. No advisors were invited, no secretaries took notes, and no husbands stood between them to soften the exchange. The two women, connected through marriage to the same monarch, yet holding distinctly different visions for the monarchy's future direction and values, faced one another with unfiltered candor. Camilla opened the conversation with accusation, claiming the emerging plans effectively allowed Charles to erase his own reign prematurely before it had reached its natural and dignified conclusion. Catherine responded measuredly that preparing William for the responsibilities ahead was not an attack upon the king, but a necessary act of protection, particularly in light of the institutional vulnerabilities and fractures already exposed during the Windsor rehearsal. What began as a discussion of ceremonial arrangements rapidly evolved into a deeper, more personal reckoning over loyalty, legacy, personal sacrifice, endurance, and the true extent of the king's confidence in each of them. Camilla spoke at length about the years of hostility, public isolation, and unrelenting media judgment she had endured alongside Charles, arguing passionately that these hard-won sacrifices had earned her a permanent and meaningful voice in shaping the monarchy's next chapter. Catherine listened with careful respect before replying that survival, however admirable and resilient, could not alone serve as the guiding purpose or moral foundation for the institution moving forward. When Camilla pressed for prominent seating arrangements and formal ceremonial roles for members of her own family during the coronation, Catherine refused. She explained that the event must remain centered on constitutional continuity and the lawful, orderly passage of sovereign responsibility rather than functioning as an occasion for private acknowledgements or rewards. Catherine then revealed the ultimate source of her authority, a signed planning instruction from Charles himself, issued in the direct aftermath of the Windsor events, which explicitly removed several disputed ceremonial elements and placed her in charge of the overall design. Camilla pushed her chair back sharply in a gesture of frustration and asked pointedly whether Catherine intended to begin functioning as queen even before the crown had been placed upon her head. Catherine rose calmly, paused for a moment at the door, and answered with quiet dignity that she intended simply to be ready when that solemn moment finally arrived. Within hours, Camilla went directly to Charles and demanded that he reverse the decisions granting Catherine such significant influence over the coronation arrangements. In the profound silence of his private office, surrounded by symbols of his long reign, the king who had spent a lifetime waiting to exercise full power now confronted the painful necessity of beginning its gradual surrender. He faced an impossible balance: protect his wife from humiliation and the sense of marginalization, or safeguard his son's transition from internal interference and potential division. For perhaps the first time in many years, Charles felt the full weight of a choice where duty to family and duty to the institution pulled in fundamentally opposite directions, forcing him to weigh love, loyalty, and the long-term survival of the monarchy he had inherited. Camilla argued with increasing intensity that Catherine's expanded authority risked portraying the current reign as already diminished and weakened before it had run its natural course. Charles listened with genuine empathy, openly acknowledging the very real pain and shared hardships that lay behind her words, born of decades navigating public scrutiny together. Yet he also recognized that the crown and its institutions could not be governed indefinitely by the understandable human need for reassurance and personal comfort. Princess Anne joined him later that evening and found him still seated beside the unsigned order, his expression heavy with contemplation. With her characteristic directness and clarity, she warned that every instance of vague or unclear instruction would inevitably create dangerous rival centers of power and influence around William. A properly structured transition schedule, she explained, was essential to move duties forward in controlled controlled stages without inviting chaos, competing claims, or institutional instability. Charles listened carefully, the weight of her counsel settling upon him as he prepared to make the final decision. Charles ultimately signed the order with a steady hand that belied the emotional weight of the moment, confirming in formal terms that Catherine's ceremonial decisions could be overruled only by William or the king himself, effectively limiting the influence of Camilla, courtiers, and extended relatives. Camilla read the first paragraph of the document in silence and quietly closed the folder without uttering a single word of protest in that instant. She removed her hand from his in a gesture heavy with unspoken sorrow and resignation. The signed transition plan also outlined a carefully staged reduction in Charles's public duties in the months leading up to the 14th of November, marking the beginning of a structured withdrawal. When the implications of the document reached William through discreet channels, the prince understood the deeper truth. His father was not merely organizing a grand ceremonial event, but initiating a deliberate, dignified, and carefully managed withdrawal from the full exercise of royal power, preparing the ground for the next reign with quiet resolve, paternal care, and a profound sense of historical responsibility. The practical consequences of the signed order began to manifest quietly but unmistakably throughout the palace corridors, offices, and private households. Briefing folders were redirected to William's team. Meetings that had long been chaired personally by Charles now appeared under the future king's name. Long-serving members of staff received instructions to prepare for the coming shift in emphasis and leadership, creating an undercurrent of change that could no longer be ignored. Camilla responded by withdrawing from several key planning sessions and directing her private household to limit direct communication with Catherine's team without her prior permission. Though she had lost formal control over significant elements of the coronation, she remained unwilling to accept the new order without some form of measured resistance. Catherine chose not to retaliate but fully recognized the warning embedded in this strategic withdrawal and the lingering tensions it represented within the family dynamic. Charles invited William to a small, unassuming private room at Windsor Castle, a space rich with shared memories from the difficult period immediately following Queen Elizabeth II's passing. The room itself carried the weight of history, simple furnishings, soft lighting, and an atmosphere that encouraged candor rather than formality. No aides waited outside the door. No official palace record would capture the conversation. For once, father and son spoke not as sovereign and heir apparent, but simply as two men confronting the profound personal costs of duty, inheritance, and the passage of time. Charles, his voice lower and more vulnerable than usual, revealed the deepest fears that had prompted his decision on the coronation date. The worry that prolonged uncertainty might leave William surrounded by divided loyalties and institutional confusion. He spoke of the painful lessons learned from the Windsor rehearsal and the reasons he had placed such extraordinary trust in Catherine's steady hand and judgment. William listened intently, his responses thoughtful and measured, acknowledging the burdens his father had carried and expressing gratitude for the preparation. Together, their exchange helped transform the forthcoming coronation from a mere transfer of power into a more meaningful act of familial reconciliation and understanding. In the protected intimacy of that Windsor room, with its muted lighting and furnishings that had witnessed generations of royal deliberations, the two men addressed long-accumulated regrets, unresolved family tensions, and the immense weight of expectations that had shaped their relationship across decades. Charles spoke candidly about the loneliness inherent in waiting for power, the decades spent in the shadow of his mother, balancing personal desires with unrelenting public duty, and the personal sacrifices that had marked his path to the throne. He reflected on the complex challenge of balancing personal love with public responsibility, particularly in his marriage and family life, where private moments had often been subordinated to the demands of the institution. William listened with growing maturity and acknowledged how the shadow of the crown had subtly influenced even their most private interactions over the years, creating distance where closeness might have flourished and formality where warmth could have prevailed. The conversation touched on pride in what had been achieved, sorrow for what had been sacrificed, and quiet hope for the future that William would inherit. It offered both men a measure of emotional resolution and peace amid the relentless machinery of succession and the burdens it imposed on generations, allowing them to confront the human cost behind the pageantry of monarchy. As the detailed phase transition schedule began to take effect across the royal household, the institution adjusted to new and evolving realities with careful pragmatism and quiet professionalism that masked the underlying emotional currents. William assumed additional responsibilities gaze with visible and consistent respect for his father's continued role as the reigning sovereign, making certain that no action or decision appeared to diminish Charles's authority prematurely or publicly. He corrected staff members on more than one occasion when they seemed to overlook the king in favor of the heir, insisting that Charles remained the sovereign until the final moment. Catherine advanced methodically with her planning for the coronation, emphasizing themes of service to the nation, national unity across divides, and the careful protection of the younger children from excessive burden while granting Prince George a meaningful supporting role appropriate to his position in the line of succession. This allowed the eldest son to begin acclimating to public life without overwhelming the younger siblings. Charles maintained his public dignity even as duties were gradually transferred away from him, attending to remaining obligations with the same sense of purpose and quiet determination that had defined his life. The family as a whole navigated these profound shifts with the maturity, restraint, emotional intelligence, and sense of duty that their unique positions demanded, balancing deeply personal emotions, private grief, and familial tensions against the greater needs of the monarchy and the expectations of a watching nation. The 14th of November 2026 now stands as considerably more than a ceremonial date on the calendar or a grand spectacle at Westminster Abbey. It represents the culmination of months of careful reflection, difficult personal choices, quiet institutional adjustments, internal reckonings, and the deliberate assertion of continuity within necessary and inevitable change. For the royal family, this transition offers a measured opportunity to demonstrate thoughtful evolution, honoring the sacrifices, traditions, and legacies of the past while adapting with realism, resilience, and forward-looking wisdom to the demands of the present age and the uncertainties of the future. In the mature and deliberate navigation of these complex human, emotional, constitutional, and political dynamics lies the best hope for the crown to reaffirm its enduring relevance and quiet strength in the years and decades ahead. The event will not simply crown a new king, it will symbolize a bridge between generations, a reaffirmation of duty tempered by humanity, and a quiet promise that the monarchy, though ancient in its roots, remains capable of renewal and service in a modern world. As the date approaches, the family moves forward with a blend of solemnity, resolve, and cautious optimism, carrying the weight of history while looking toward what the next chapter may bring.